Ma'am, you need to move your vehicle immediately. This is an emergency response.
I don't care what you think this is. That siren is disturbing my peace, and I'm not moving until you turn it off.
Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to wake up the entire neighborhood.
Linda Harrison had lived on Maple Street for 37 years. She'd watched the quiet suburban neighborhood transform from a peaceful residential area into what she considered a thoroughfare for emergency vehicles that had no respect for the community they served. At 62 years old, Linda had developed very strong opinions about noise pollution, property values, and what she called the militarization of public services. On that Tuesday afternoon in September, her frustration with sirens and emergency vehicle noise would escalate into a confrontation that would end her freedom, cost her everything she'd worked for, and expose a mindset so dangerous that it would shock an entire city. But before we dive into this absolutely devastating story, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Your country, your state, wherever you are. And if you believe that emergency responders deserve clear roads to save lives, hit that subscribe button. This story gets even more intense, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Linda Harrison wasn't someone who typically caused trouble. She was a retired administrative assistant who'd worked for the same insurance company for 41 years. She owned her modest two-story colonial home outright, kept an immaculate garden, and served on the neighborhood watch committee. Her neighbors described her as particular about things, someone who noticed every detail and wasn't afraid to voice her concerns about anything that affected the community. Linda had strong feelings about emergency vehicle protocols. Over the past 5 years, she'd filed 17 formal complaints with the city about what she considered excessive siren use. She'd attended city council meetings to argue that ambulances and fire trucks were using sirens unnecessarily, disturbing residents during what she called non-critical situations. She'd researched noise ordinances and had become convinced that emergency responders were violating municipal regulations about decibel levels in residential areas. That Tuesday was an unusually warm September afternoon. Linda had been working in her front garden, deadheading roses and preparing flower beds for fall planting. She was wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, completely absorbed in her work when she heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. As the sound grew louder, Linda's jaw tightened. She recognized the pattern immediately. Full sirens, air horn blasts, the entire emergency response protocol that she believed was completely unnecessary for most calls. She'd researched emergency response guidelines and was convinced that true life-threatening emergencies requiring full siren protocols were rare. In her mind, most ambulance calls were routine medical transports that didn't justify the noise disruption to residential neighborhoods. The ambulance turned onto Maple Street, sirens wailing, emergency lights flashing. Linda stood up from her garden, pulled off her gloves, and made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to let another emergency vehicle disturb her neighborhood without consequences. She walked to her driveway, got into her silver Honda Accord, backed out, and positioned her vehicle directly across Maple Street, blocking both lanes of traffic. Paramedic Sarah Chen had been with Metro Emergency Services for 12 years. She'd responded to thousands of calls, saved countless lives, and had never encountered anything like what was about to happen. Her partner, Michael Torres, was driving Code 3 to a cardiac arrest call at 847 Maple Street. The dispatcher had been clear about the severity. 68-year-old male, chest pain, possible heart attack, family member performing CPR. Every second mattered. Chen had already prepared medications and equipment. Torres had calculated the fastest route, avoiding school zones and construction areas. They were 3 blocks away when they encountered an obstacle that defied comprehension. A silver Honda Accord sat sideways across Maple Street, completely blocking their path. Torres immediately activated the air horn, assuming the driver hadn't noticed the approaching ambulance. The car didn't move. He activated the PA system and announced their presence. Still no movement. Chen looked ahead and saw a woman standing next to the vehicle, arms crossed, staring directly at them with what appeared to be determination rather than confusion. Torres pulled the ambulance to within 20 feet of the Honda and stepped out. This was when Linda Harrison made her position clear. She informed the paramedics that she lived on this street, had endured years of unnecessary noise from emergency vehicles, and would not permit them to continue with sirens activated. She demanded they turn off all emergency equipment before proceeding through her neighborhood. Torres explained they were responding to a cardiac arrest. Linda's response was that she didn't believe their emergency was genuine and that they were using excessive noise protocols for what was probably a routine medical call. Chen radioed for police backup while Torres attempted to reason with Linda. The conversation was surreal. Linda maintained that she had researched emergency response protocols and knew that true cardiac emergencies were rare. She insisted that most ambulance calls were elderly people with minor complaints who called for transportation to hospitals. She'd studied response statistics and was convinced that full emergency protocols were only justified for major trauma or confirmed life-threatening situations. Torres tried explaining that they couldn't determine the severity of cardiac events without proper assessment, and that every chest pain call was treated as potentially fatal. Linda disagreed and refused to move her vehicle. Meanwhile, at 847 Maple Street, Robert Martinez was dying. The 68-year-old retired teacher had collapsed in his kitchen while preparing lunch. His wife Carmen had found him unconscious, called 911, and was performing CPR as instructed by the dispatcher. Carmen could hear sirens in the distance, but they weren't getting closer. She continued chest compressions, counting aloud, praying that help would arrive in time. The dispatcher stayed on the line, encouraging her, but Carmen was exhausted and terrified. Her husband's lips were turning blue. She needed professional help immediately. The first police unit arrived at Linda's roadblock 6 minutes after the initial confrontation began. Officer David Kim assessed the situation quickly. An ambulance blocked by a civilian vehicle, paramedics explaining they had a cardiac arrest call, and a woman refusing to move while citing noise complaints. Kim approached Linda and explained that she was interfering with emergency medical services, which was a serious criminal offense. Linda's response revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about emergency protocols and the severity of her actions. She told Officer Kim that she was exercising her rights as a homeowner to protect her property values and quality of life. She claimed that excessive emergency vehicle noise was decreasing property values throughout the neighborhood, and that she was taking a stand against what she called municipal overreach. She insisted that if this was a genuine emergency, the ambulance could proceed without sirens and emergency lights, which would be quieter and less disruptive to residents. When Kim explained that emergency vehicles were legally required to use warning devices during Code 3 responses, Linda accused him of not understanding noise ordinances and demanded to speak with his supervisor. The ambulance had now been blocked for 8 minutes. Chen was calculating drug dosages for cardiac arrest protocols while monitoring radio traffic about their delayed response. Torres was splitting his attention between reasoning with Linda and preparing for the worst-case scenario they might find when they finally reached their patient. Both paramedics understood that brain death begins approximately 4 minutes after cardiac arrest, and that their delay could mean the difference between survival and fatality for their patient. Officer Kim made the decision that Linda Harrison had forced him to make. He placed her under arrest for interfering with emergency services, obstruction of justice, and reckless endangerment. Linda's reaction was immediate and intense. She began shouting that she was being persecuted for exercising her constitutional rights as a property owner. She demanded to know why emergency responders were given special privileges to disturb residential neighborhoods without accountability. As Kim handcuffed her, Linda continued her lecture about noise pollution and municipal overreach, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her actions were potentially costing someone their life. The ambulance finally reached Robert Martinez 14 minutes after the initial 911 call. In normal circumstances, with clear roads, the response time should have been 6 minutes. Carmen Martinez was still performing CPR when Chen and Torres burst through the front door, but she was weakening. Her compressions had become less effective. Robert's condition had deteriorated significantly during the 8-minute delay caused by Linda's roadblock. Chen immediately took over CPR, while Torres prepared advanced life support interventions. Robert's pulse was weak and irregular. His blood pressure was dangerously low. The extended period without professional medical intervention had caused complications that might have been prevented with timely response. Linda Harrison was transported to the county jail while paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Robert Martinez. She spent the ride complaining to the arresting officer about the violation of her rights and the excessive response to what she called a simple noise dispute. She insisted that she hadn't intended to harm anyone and that her actions were justified by years of sleep disruption and property value concerns. When Officer Kim explained that her roadblock had delayed emergency medical care for a cardiac arrest victim, Linda's response was that she still didn't believe the emergency was genuine. She maintained that emergency services exaggerated the severity of calls to justify their protocols and budgets. At the hospital, Robert Martinez underwent emergency cardiac catheterization. The delay in treatment had allowed significant heart muscle damage to occur. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending cardiologist, later testified that the 8-minute delay in professional medical intervention had directly contributed to the extent of cardiac damage. Robert survived, but with permanent heart damage that would require lifelong medication and significantly reduced quality of life. The medical team was clear that earlier intervention could have prevented much of the damage to his heart muscle. Carmen Martinez waited in the hospital corridor, not yet knowing that a neighbor's noise complaint had nearly cost her husband his life. She would later learn that while she was performing CPR and praying for help to arrive, Linda Harrison was blocking the ambulance and lecturing paramedics about siren protocols. The knowledge would haunt Carmen for months. She'd done everything right, called for help immediately, performed CPR correctly, and followed dispatcher instructions perfectly. But a neighbor she'd never met had decided that her husband's emergency wasn't worth the noise disruption. Linda's booking process at the county jail was unlike anything the staff had experienced. Most people arrested for interfering with emergency services showed some remorse or understanding of the seriousness of their actions. Linda remained convinced that she was the victim of an overreaction by authorities who didn't understand property rights and noise ordinances. She demanded to speak with a lawyer, not because she understood the criminal charges she faced, but because she wanted to file complaints against the police department and emergency medical services for what she called harassment and violation of her civil rights. The charges against Linda Harrison were serious and numerous. Interfering with emergency medical services carried a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison. Obstruction of justice could result in additional prison time. Reckless endangerment was classified as a felony because her actions had directly endangered Robert Martinez's life. The district attorney's office reviewed the case and determined that Linda's actions were so egregious and dangerous that they warranted prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or momentary lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate decision to block emergency medical care based on noise complaints. Local media picked up the story within hours. "Woman arrested for blocking ambulance over noise complaints" became a headline that spread across social media platforms. The details seemed almost impossible to believe. A cardiac arrest victim, an ambulance blocked by a noise complaint, 8 minutes of delay that caused permanent heart damage. The story resonated with people because it represented something deeper than just one person's poor judgment. It showed how self-centered thinking could escalate into actions that endangered innocent lives. The neighborhood where Linda had lived for 37 years was divided in their reactions. Some neighbors expressed shock and disbelief that Linda would do something so dangerous. Others admitted they'd heard her complaints about emergency vehicle noise, but never imagined she would take such drastic action. Several neighbors revealed that Linda had approached them over the years about organizing complaints against emergency services for excessive siren use. Most had politely declined, but Linda had continued her campaign against what she called noise pollution from municipal services. Emergency medical services across the city were stunned by the incident. Paramedics and EMTs had dealt with difficult situations before, but never someone who deliberately blocked emergency response while lecturing them about noise ordinances. Sarah Chen and Michael Torres were interviewed by local news stations and described the surreal experience of trying to reason with someone who refused to acknowledge that blocking an ambulance could kill someone. The incident prompted emergency services to review protocols for dealing with civilian interference and to work with law enforcement on rapid response procedures for similar situations. Linda's family was mortified when they learned about her arrest. Her adult children lived in other states and hadn't been aware of the extent of their mother's obsession with emergency vehicle noise. They knew she'd been filing complaints and attending city council meetings, but they'd assumed it was typical neighborhood activism. Learning that she'd blocked an ambulance and endangered someone's life was devastating. They issued public apologies to the Martinez family and to emergency responders, while trying to understand how their mother's noise complaints had escalated into criminal behavior. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Linda's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney's office was firm about the seriousness of the charges. The case had attracted significant public attention, and there was concern that lenient treatment would send the wrong message about interfering with emergency services. Linda initially refused plea offers because she maintained that her actions were justified and that she was being prosecuted for exercising her property rights. Her attorney struggled to make her understand that blocking an ambulance was never legally justified, regardless of noise concerns. Robert Martinez spent 6 days in the hospital recovering from his heart attack and the complications caused by delayed treatment. When he learned that a neighbor's noise complaint had blocked the ambulance responding to save his life, he was initially angry, then deeply saddened by the selfishness of Linda's actions. Robert had been a teacher for 42 years, had dedicated his life to serving his community, and couldn't comprehend how someone could prioritize noise complaints over human life. Carmen Martinez was even more affected by the revelation. She'd trusted that when she called for help would come as quickly as possible. Learning that her husband had suffered additional heart damage because of a neighbor's deliberate interference was traumatic. Have you ever encountered someone so focused on minor inconveniences that they lose sight of what really matters? Drop your answer in the comments below. The story of Linda Harrison's arrest sent shockwaves through the emergency medical community nationwide. Within 48 hours, the incident had been shared in emergency services forums across the country. Paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, and police officers were discussing the case, sharing their own experiences with civilian interference and expressing concern about what appeared to be a growing trend of people who felt entitled to interfere with emergency operations based on personal grievances. Dr. Marcus Thompson, Director of Emergency Medicine at Metro General Hospital, held a press conference 3 days after Linda's arrest. He explained that cardiac arrest survival rates drop by 10% for every minute that professional medical intervention is delayed. The 8-minute delay caused by Linda's roadblock had reduced Robert Martinez's chances of full recovery from approximately 70% to less than 20%. Dr. Thompson's presentation included charts and statistics that made the impact of Linda's actions undeniably clear. Her noise complaint had caused permanent, irreversible damage to an innocent man's heart. The Martinez family decided to speak publicly about their experience. Robert appeared at a community meeting 2 weeks after his release from the hospital, still weak but determined to help people understand the consequences of Linda's actions. He spoke slowly, his voice still affected by his medical ordeal, describing the terror Carmen had felt while performing CPR and waiting for help that was being deliberately delayed by someone they'd never met. Carmen broke down while describing how helpless she'd felt, as her husband's condition worsened during those critical minutes when professional help was blocked just 3 blocks away. Linda's case became a rallying point for emergency services reform advocates who had been pushing for stronger penalties for interference with emergency operations. State legislators began drafting new laws that would make blocking emergency vehicles a more serious felony with mandatory minimum sentences. The Linda Harrison case, as it became known in legislative circles, provided clear evidence that existing penalties weren't sufficient to deter people from endangering lives through selfish actions. Social media reaction to Linda's story was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Video clips from news interviews were shared millions of times, with comments expressing outrage at her lack of remorse and continued insistence that her noise complaints justified blocking an ambulance. Many people shared their own stories of emergency responders saving their lives or the lives of loved ones, emphasizing how delays could mean the difference between life and death. The hashtag #SaveLivesNotComplaints began trending as people expressed support for emergency responders and condemnation of Linda's actions. Linda remained in county jail while awaiting trial, unable to make the $50,000 bail that had been set by the judge who described her actions as profoundly dangerous and selfish. Her continued lack of remorse during jail interviews with court-appointed psychologists became part of the prosecution's case. She maintained that she was being persecuted for standing up to government overreach and that emergency services were exaggerating the severity of the situation to justify their excessive response protocols. Her inability to understand that she'd endangered someone's life became a central issue in determining her competency to stand trial. The Emergency Medical Services Union issued a formal statement about the Linda Harrison case, calling for legislation that would make interfering with emergency responders a federal crime. Union President Michael Rodriguez pointed out that emergency responders already faced enough dangers in their daily work without having to worry about civilians deliberately blocking their access to patients. The statement included statistics about response times and survival rates that demonstrated how critical every minute was in emergency medical situations. Carmen Martinez started attending city council meetings to advocate for stronger protections for emergency responders. Her testimony was powerful and emotional as she described watching her husband suffer additional heart damage because someone had decided that noise complaints were more important than saving lives. She became the face of a growing movement to hold people accountable for interfering with emergency services. Her advocacy work helped pass local ordinances that increased penalties for blocking emergency vehicles and required mandatory education about emergency response protocols for anyone convicted of interference. Linda's adult daughter Jennifer flew in from Seattle to visit her mother in jail and try to understand how someone she thought she knew could do something so dangerous. The visit was devastating for Jennifer, who found her mother unchanged in her beliefs and still convinced that she'd been wrongfully arrested for exercising her rights as a homeowner. Linda spent the entire visit complaining about jail conditions and demanding that Jennifer contact media outlets to tell her side of the story. When Jennifer tried to explain that blocking an ambulance was inexcusable regardless of noise concerns, Linda accused her of being brainwashed by government propaganda about emergency services. The local fire chief used Linda's case as a teaching moment for his department, explaining to firefighters and paramedics how to document civilian interference and when to immediately request police backup. He emphasized that their primary responsibility was reaching patients as quickly as possible, and that they shouldn't spend excessive time trying to reason with people who were deliberately obstructing emergency operations. The Linda Harrison Protocol, as it became known in the department, called for immediate arrest of anyone who refused to move after being informed they were blocking emergency response. Robert Martinez's cardiologist testified before the state legislature about the medical impact of delayed emergency response. Dr. Jennifer Walsh explained that heart muscle begins dying within minutes of a cardiac arrest and that the damage is cumulative and permanent. She presented Robert's case as clear evidence that civilian interference with emergency services wasn't just an inconvenience, but a direct threat to public health and safety. Her testimony helped convince lawmakers to pass stronger penalties for emergency services interference. The neighborhood where Linda had lived for 37 years began organizing to support the Martinez family and to distance themselves from Linda's actions. Residents started a fund to help cover Robert's medical expenses and to support emergency services training in their community. The neighborhood association passed a resolution condemning interference with emergency responders and pledging to support legislation that would prevent similar incidents. Many residents expressed shame that someone from their neighborhood had caused such harm to an innocent family. Linda's attorney, Sarah Mitchell, struggled with a client who refused to accept responsibility for her actions or show any understanding of their consequences. Mitchell had handled many difficult cases, but had never represented someone so completely divorced from reality about the harm they'd caused. During preparation meetings, Linda continued to insist that her actions were justified and that she was being persecuted by a system that didn't understand property rights. Mitchell realized that Linda's lack of remorse would make any plea negotiation extremely difficult, and that a trial might be the only option. Emergency services departments across the region began implementing new training protocols based on the Linda Harrison incident. Paramedics and EMTs received instruction on how to quickly assess civilian interference situations and when to immediately request police backup rather than attempting to negotiate with obstructive individuals. The training emphasized that their primary responsibility was reaching patients, and that dealing with interference was a law enforcement issue, not a medical one. The prosecutor assigned to Linda's case, District Attorney Margaret Chen, decided to pursue maximum penalties to send a clear message that interfering with emergency services would not be tolerated. Chen had prosecuted many cases involving harm to public safety, but had rarely encountered someone whose actions were so clearly motivated by selfishness and whose lack of remorse was so complete. She viewed Linda's case as an opportunity to establish legal precedent that would protect emergency responders and the patients they served. Local emergency room staff began sharing their own stories about how response time delays affected patient outcomes. Nurses and doctors who had seen patients arrive too late for optimal treatment spoke publicly about the critical importance of rapid emergency response. Their testimonies added medical credibility to the growing movement for stronger penalties for emergency services interference. Many healthcare workers expressed frustration that they had to explain why blocking ambulances was dangerous, something they thought should be obvious to any reasonable person. The Martinez family's story became a catalyst for nationwide discussion about emergency services protection. News outlets across the country picked up their story, interviewing emergency responders about similar incidents they'd encountered. The coverage revealed that Linda Harrison's actions weren't completely isolated, that there had been other incidents of civilians interfering with emergency response for various selfish reasons. The pattern of interference highlighted the need for stronger legal protections and public education about emergency services protocols. Linda's former colleagues at the insurance company, where she'd worked for 41 years, were shocked by her arrest and the details of her actions. Many expressed disbelief that someone they'd worked with for decades could endanger someone's life over noise complaints. Several former co-workers gave interviews describing Linda as someone who'd always been particular about rules and procedures, but who they'd never imagined could do something so dangerous. The revelation changed how they viewed someone they thought they'd known well. The city council, where Linda had frequently appeared to complain about emergency vehicle noise, held a special session to address the incident and to review their policies for handling citizen complaints. Council members expressed embarrassment that someone had used their public forum to build a case for actions that endangered public safety. They implemented new procedures for evaluating complaints against emergency services and for educating complainants about the critical nature of emergency response protocols. Should there be mandatory education about emergency services for anyone who files complaints against emergency responders? Let me know what you think in the comments. The psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court revealed disturbing insights into Linda's mental state and her complete inability to comprehend the severity of her actions. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychiatrist with 25 years of experience, had evaluated hundreds of defendants but rarely encountered someone so fundamentally disconnected from the consequences of their behavior. During 3 separate sessions, Linda maintained that she was the victim of government overreach and that emergency responders were part of a conspiracy to violate citizens' rights through excessive noise protocols. Dr. Williams documented that Linda showed no signs of mental illness that would explain her actions, but rather displayed what she termed pathological self-centeredness, combined with an inability to empathize with others. Linda's responses during the evaluation were chilling in their complete lack of remorse. When asked how she felt about Robert Martinez's heart damage, Linda replied that she still wasn't convinced his emergency was genuine and that people exaggerate medical situations to get faster service. When presented with medical evidence about cardiac arrest survival rates, Linda dismissed it as propaganda designed to justify emergency services budgets. The evaluation revealed that Linda had spent years building an elaborate justification system for her grievances against emergency responders. She had researched obscure municipal codes, collected noise-level measurements, and developed conspiracy theories about emergency services deliberately creating unnecessary disturbances. Dr. Williams noted that Linda had constructed an entire worldview where her noise complaints were heroic acts of civil disobedience rather than dangerous interference with life-saving services. Meanwhile, Robert Martinez was struggling with his recovery and the psychological impact of learning that his heart damage was caused by a neighbor's selfishness. His cardiologist explained that the extent of muscle death in his heart meant he would never return to his previous level of activity. Simple tasks like climbing stairs or carrying groceries now left him breathless. The retirement he and Carmen had planned, filled with travel and outdoor activities, was no longer possible. Robert's quality of life had been permanently diminished because Linda Harrison couldn't tolerate the sound of sirens. Carmen Martinez developed what her doctor diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder related to the incident. She experienced panic attacks whenever she heard emergency sirens, reliving those terrifying minutes when she performed CPR while help was deliberately blocked just blocks away. She couldn't sleep through the night, haunted by thoughts of how close they'd come to losing everything because of someone's noise complaints. The counselor treating Carmen said she'd rarely seen trauma so directly connected to another person's deliberate cruelty. The legal team representing the city in potential civil litigation began calculating the massive financial exposure created by Linda's actions. Robert's medical bills were approaching $200,000 and would continue for the rest of his life. Lost income from his early retirement due to heart damage added hundreds of thousands more. Pain and suffering damages could reach into the millions. The city's insurance company was already discussing settlement figures that would bankrupt most individuals, but Linda's assets were minimal compared to the harm she'd caused. Linda's preliminary hearing drew a packed courtroom filled with emergency responders, community members, and media representatives. Judge Robert Thompson, a 30-year veteran of the bench, had presided over thousands of criminal cases, but said he'd never encountered someone whose actions were so clearly motivated by selfishness and whose victims were so obviously innocent. When Linda's attorney entered a not guilty plea, the judge's expression showed his disbelief that anyone would contest charges so clearly supported by evidence. The Emergency Medical Services Director used Linda's case to lobby the state legislature for enhanced penalties that would make interfering with emergency responders a Class C felony with mandatory minimum sentences. Director Patricia Walsh testified that Linda's 8-minute roadblock had caused more damage to a patient than many assault cases they'd seen. Yet existing laws treated emergency services interference as a minor misdemeanor. She argued that people who endangered lives through deliberate interference deserved prison sentences comparable to those given for assault with a deadly weapon. Social workers who responded to domestic violence calls began sharing stories about how delayed response times affected victim safety. Linda's case had opened discussions about civilian interference that went far beyond ambulance calls. Police officers reported incidents where people had blocked emergency vehicles responding to domestic violence, armed robberies, and other dangerous situations. The pattern suggested that Linda Harrison wasn't an isolated case, but part of a broader problem of civilians who felt entitled to interfere with emergency operations based on personal grievances. Linda Harrison's trial ended with a guilty verdict on all charges. She received the maximum sentence of 5 years in prison, becoming the first person in the state to face such severe penalties for interfering with emergency services. Robert Martinez survived, but lives with permanent heart damage that could have been prevented. Carmen still struggles with trauma from watching her husband nearly die while help was blocked 3 blocks away. Emergency services across the nation now use Linda's case to train responders on civilian interference protocols. Her name has become synonymous with the dangerous consequences of putting personal complaints above human life. This story matters because it shows how quickly selfishness can escalate into actions that destroy innocent lives. Linda's noise complaints weren't just annoying, they were deadly.